Something was knocking beneath the floor, soft at first, like a mistake the world hadn't noticed yet, but it didn't stop, and the longer it went unheard, the louder the silence above it became. The ceremony hall shimmered in gold and amber light, chandeliers hanging like frozen stars over polished stone, the air thick with perfume and quiet ambition, every breath measured, every movement watched, because tonight was selection night, and in this place, worth was decided in front of everyone. Lena Whitmore stood near the far edge of the hall, just inside the boundary where shadows still touched the walls, her hands folded carefully at her waist, as if stillness alone could make her disappear, her dress simple and worn compared to the silk and shimmer around her, the fabric brushing lightly against her ankles as people passed without looking twice. The floor beneath her feet felt colder than it should have, a strange chill seeping through the soles of her shoes, but no one else seemed to notice, or maybe they chose not to. Names were being called one by one, each echo rising into the vaulted ceiling before dissolving into murmurs, and each time an alpha stepped forward, the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, like gravity bending around power. Lena kept her eyes lowered, not out of obedience, but out of habit, because meeting the wrong gaze here could turn attention into something sharp and unwanted, and she had learned long ago that attention was rarely kind. A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd as another name was chosen, followed by applause that sounded rehearsed rather than real, and somewhere behind her, someone laughed softly, the kind of laugh meant to be heard without being acknowledged. Her name had already been called once, earlier than expected, and just as quickly passed over, like a line spoken too fast to matter, the silence that followed heavier than any rejection spoken aloud. She hadn't reacted then, not outwardly, but her fingers had tightened just enough to crease the fabric of her dress, the only sign that the moment had landed somewhere deeper. A servant carrying a tray brushed past her too quickly, the edge of the tray tipping just enough for a glass to slide, and Lena moved without thinking, catching it before it fell, her hand steady even as the servant flinched. "Careful," she whispered, placing it back, her voice low enough to vanish beneath the music, and the servant blinked at her in brief surprise before nodding and hurrying on. No one else saw it, or if they did, they didn't care, but something in that small moment lingered, like a thread pulled tight in a place no one was watching. Across the hall, the Alpha King had not yet spoken. His presence felt more than seen, a stillness at the center of everything, the kind that made conversations falter and eyes shift without knowing why. Lena didn't look toward him, not directly, but she felt the weight of the space he occupied, the quiet pressure that seemed to hum beneath the polished stone, and for a second, just a second, that same strange chill under her feet pulsed again, sharper this time, as if something below had answered something above. The music swelled, covering it, smoothing over the edges of the moment, but Lena's breath caught anyway, a small hitch she couldn't explain, her gaze flickering down toward the floor before she forced it still again. No one noticed. No one ever did. Above, the ceremony continued, voices rising and falling in practiced rhythm, while below, unseen and unheard, something persisted, steady and patient, waiting for the moment when silence would finally break. The chill beneath Lena's feet did not fade. It deepened, settling into the bones of the hall like something that had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. And this time she could not ignore it, not when it pulsed again, faint but deliberate, like a heartbeat buried under layers of stone and silence. She shifted her weight slightly, the movement small enough to go unnoticed, but her attention sharpened, her senses narrowing to the space beneath her as the sounds of the ceremony blurred at the edges, voices turning distant, laughter thinning into something hollow. Another name was called, followed by polite applause, but Lena barely heard it, her focus drawn downward, to the cold that now felt almost alive, brushing against her awareness in a way that made her breath slow, then catch. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves, just the weight of the night pressing in, but her instincts did not agree, and instincts, even in someone like her, were rarely wrong. A faint vibration traveled through the floor, so slight it could have been imagined, but it came again, a soft, uneven rhythm that did not match the music above, and without thinking, Lena bent just a fraction, her fingers hovering near the surface of the stone, as if she could feel it more clearly that way. The moment stretched, fragile and uncertain, before she straightened again, forcing her hands back into stillness, because drawing attention here was dangerous, and she had survived this long by knowing when to stay invisible. Still, the feeling lingered, threading through her chest, pulling at something deeper than thought, something that recognized the difference between silence and something being silenced. Across the hall, the Alpha King remained unmoving, yet the air around him had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a storm forming beyond the horizon, unseen but inevitable. And though Lena did not look directly at him, she felt it, the same way she felt the pulse beneath her feet, two currents moving in opposite directions toward the same point. The ceremony continued, structured and precise, but cracks were forming in places no one acknowledged, small disruptions that did not belong in such a controlled space. A glass set down too hard, a voice faltering mid-sentence, a pause that lingered just a second too long. Lena exhaled slowly, trying to steady the tightness in her chest, but it only grew stronger, a quiet urgency pressing against her ribs, urging her to move, to step away, to do something she could not quite name. Before she could decide, a figure approached from behind, footsteps measured, deliberate, stopping just close enough to make their presence known without drawing attention. "You are needed below," a low voice said, calm but firm, and Lena turned slightly, just enough to see the edge of a dark uniform. The insignia unfamiliar but official enough that refusal did not feel like an option. Her first instinct was to question it, but that instinct had been trained out of her years ago, replaced by compliance that kept her safe, or at least unnoticed. Now, the voice added quietly, and there was something in it that left no room for hesitation. Lena nodded once, the movement small, controlled, and stepped away from the edge of the hall, her path carefully chosen to avoid disrupting the ceremony, to slip through the spaces between people where attention did not linger. No one stopped her, no one asked where she was going, because no one was watching her closely enough to care, and that, more than anything, made the unease in her chest sharpen. The further she moved from the center of the hall, the colder the air became, the warmth of the chandeliers fading behind her as the lighting dimmed, shadows stretching longer along the walls, the polished stone beneath her feet losing its shine, its surface turning dull and uneven. The sounds of the ceremony softened with each step, replaced by a quiet that felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She reached the narrow corridor that led away from the main hall, the entrance partially hidden behind a column most guests would never notice, and for a moment, she hesitated, her hand hovering near the edge of the stone as that same faint pulse echoed again, stronger now, closer. Something below was still there, still waiting, and without fully understanding why, Lena felt as though whatever it was had been waiting for her. The corridor swallowed the last traces of music the moment Lena stepped inside, the sound fading behind her as if the door she had not seen close had sealed it away, leaving only the quiet hum of stone and the soft echo of her own footsteps marking time. The air felt different here, heavier, cooler by several degrees, brushing against her skin like a warning she could not fully understand, and the faint pulse she had felt above was no longer distant. It was clearer now, threading through the walls, rising from somewhere below with a rhythm that did not belong to the structure of the building. She slowed without meaning to, each step measured as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The corridor narrowing just enough to feel intentional, as if it guided rather than allowed passage, the walls smooth but worn in places, marked by years of use that were never spoken about in the main hall. Behind her, the presence that had summoned her remained just out of view, not close enough to touch, but close enough to remind her she was not here by accident, and that returning was no longer an option she could take without consequence. "This way," the voice said again, softer now, yet more certain, and Lena followed, because not following felt like stepping into something worse than the unknown. The path turned once, then again, each shift in direction pulling her further from the warmth above, the light thinning until it became a dull glow that barely reached the floor, shadows stretching across the stone like silent observers. The pulse grew stronger with each step, no longer something she could dismiss as imagination. It was real, steady, uneven, like something struggling to be heard through layers meant to keep it hidden. Lena pressed her lips together, her breath shallow but controlled, her mind searching for reason, for explanation, but finding none that fit the feeling settling in her chest. It was not fear, not exactly. It was something closer to recognition, a quiet certainty that whatever waited below was connected to her in a way she had not been prepared to face. The corridor ended at a narrow staircase, the steps descending into deeper shadow, the air below colder still, carrying a faint scent of dust and stone untouched by light. Lena hesitated at the top, her hand hovering near the wall as that pulse rose again, stronger now, almost aligned with her own heartbeat, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single rhythm, hers and not hers at the same time. Go, the voice urged, and there was no force in it, no raised tone, but something in it pressed against her instincts in a way that made resistance feel impossible. Lena stepped onto the first stair, the sound soft beneath her weight, then another, and another, each movement drawing her further down as the darkness closed in, not suffocating, but encompassing, like a space that had been waiting to be filled. The light from above faded until it was nothing more than a memory behind her, and yet she could still see, not clearly, but enough, as if her senses were adjusting to something beyond sight. The pulse was louder now, no longer hidden. It echoed through the space, a quiet insistence that filled the silence between each step, and Lena's hand moved instinctively to her chest, fingers pressing lightly against the steady beat beneath her ribs, trying to separate what was hers from what was not. At the base of the stairs, the space opened into a low chamber, the ceiling just high enough to stand, the walls rougher here, less refined, as if this place had not been meant for anyone important enough to warrant care. The floor beneath her feet was colder than anything she had felt above, the stone uneven, and in the center of the room, there was a section that looked different, the surface slightly raised, as though something beneath it pressed upward without ever breaking through. Lena stopped just short of it, her breath catching as the pulse surged again, strong and unmistakable, and this time, there was no doubt. It was coming from directly beneath that spot, something alive, something waiting, something that should not have been hidden here at all. Behind her, the presence that had guided her remained silent now, watching, waiting, and for the first time since she had left the hall, Lena felt something shift inside her, not fear, not confusion, but a quiet, unyielding resolve that rose to meet the rhythm beneath her feet, as if whatever lay below was not just calling to be found, but calling to her specifically. Lena did not step back, even when every instinct she had ever relied on told her that this place was not meant for someone like her, that whatever lay beneath the raised stone at the center of the chamber had been hidden for a reason, and that reasons like this were rarely kind. Yet the pulse beneath her feet did not waver. It called, steady and insistent, as if it recognized her presence the moment she crossed the threshold. She drew in a slow breath, the air cool and dry against her lungs, and lowered herself. Carefully, her fingers brushing against the uneven surface of the stone, the texture rougher here, imperfect, as though it had been placed quickly, deliberately, to conceal rather than to support. The moment her skin made contact, the pulse surged, stronger than before, no longer distant or muffled, but immediate, alive, and unmistakably aware, and Lena's breath caught as a warmth spread from her fingertips, subtle at first, then deeper, threading up her arm in a way that made her heart stutter. She pulled her hand back slightly, not in fear, but in surprise, her gaze fixed on the exact point where she had touched, as if expecting the stone itself to shift, to respond, to reveal something that had been hidden too long. Behind her, the silence remained unbroken, the presence that had led her here offering no explanation, no instruction, only watchful stillness that pressed at the edges of her awareness without ever stepping forward. Lena swallowed, the quiet in the room stretching thin as the pulse beneath the floor grew more uneven, more urgent, and she realized with a clarity that settled deep in her chest that whatever was below was not simply there. It was weakening, fading, its rhythm struggling to hold. The thought struck her harder than it should have, a sharp, unexpected pull that made her shift closer without thinking, her hands returning to the stone, this time with intention rather than hesitation. "You are not alone," she whispered, the words leaving her before she could stop them, soft enough to be lost in the still air. Yet the moment they formed, the pulse beneath her answered, not louder, but steadier, as if the sound of her voice had anchored it in place. Lena exhaled slowly, something inside her settling even as her surroundings remained uncertain, and she pressed her palms flat against the surface, closing her eyes for just a moment as she focused on the rhythm beneath, letting it guide her rather than resist it. The warmth returned, stronger this time, spreading through her hands, into her chest, until the two heartbeats seemed to align, hers and the one hidden below, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. A faint shift traveled through the stone, barely noticeable, but enough to send a quiet tremor through the chamber, dust loosening from the edges as if the structure itself responded to the connection forming. Lena's eyes opened, her breath catching as she felt it again, that subtle movement, not breaking, not collapsing, but loosening, yielding just enough to suggest that what had been sealed could be undone. She did not question it, did not pause to consider what would happen if she was wrong, because the certainty in her chest had already taken hold, stronger than doubt, stronger than caution. Carefully, she shifted her hands, fingers searching along the edge of the raised section until she found a narrow seam, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, and the moment she traced it, the pulse beneath surged once more, as if urging her forward. Lena pressed gently, not forcing, not breaking, but following the give she could feel beneath her touch, and the stone responded, slowly at first, then with a quiet release that echoed through the chamber in a low, hollow sound. The surface lifted just enough to reveal the darkness below, deeper than the shadows around her, carrying with it a rush of colder air that brushed against her face, like something long sealed away. Lena leaned forward, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on the opening as the pulse rose to meet her, clearer now, closer, no longer hidden behind layers of stone, but just beyond reach, waiting for the final barrier to fall. And for the first time since she had entered the chamber, the presence behind her shifted, not stepping forward, not speaking, but reacting, the stillness breaking just enough to suggest that whatever was happening now was no longer unfolding according to plan, and Lena understood, without needing to turn, that this moment was not meant to exist, and yet it did, because she was here. The darkness beneath the lifted stone did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if the air itself held a presence that had been waiting too long to be acknowledged. And as Lena leaned closer, the faint rhythm she had followed began to shift, no longer distant or muffled, but close. Enough that she could feel it echo through her chest with every breath she took. The opening was narrow, just wide enough for a person to reach through, but not enough to fully see what lay below, the shadows too deep, swallowing light instead of reflecting it. And yet there was something there, something that drew her forward despite the quiet warning at the back of her mind. She lowered herself further, one hand braced against the stone as the other reached into the opening, her fingers moving slowly, carefully, until they met something that was not stone, not empty space, but warmth, faint and unsteady, like the last trace of heat left behind after a fire had nearly gone out. Her breath caught, her entire body stilling as the contact sent a sharp awareness through her senses, not pain, not fear, but something deeper, something that felt like recognition without memory. The moment her skin touched whatever lay below, the pulse surged, stronger than it had been at any point before, and Lena's heart responded without permission, matching it, aligning with it, as if the two rhythms had always been meant to meet at this exact moment. She did not pull away, even as the sensation intensified, even as the space around her seemed to shift in response, the air tightening, the silence growing heavier, as if the chamber itself understood that something irreversible had begun. "Stay with me," she whispered again, her voice steadier now, grounded by the connection forming between her and the unseen presence beneath her hand, and for a brief moment, the rhythm steadied, the uneven pattern smoothing into something more consistent, more certain. Behind her, the presence that had guided her here moved at last, a step forward that echoed softly against the stone, followed by another, the controlled distance closing just enough to make its intent clear. "That is enough," the voice said, no longer quiet, no longer neutral, but edged with something that had not been there before, something sharper, more deliberate. Lena's fingers tightened instinctively, not in defiance, but in response to the sudden shift, her attention refusing to break from the connection she had found, because letting go now felt wrong in a way she could not explain. Step back, the voice continued, closer now, and this time there was no mistaking the command beneath it. But Lena did not move, not because she was choosing to disobey, but because her body no longer felt entirely her own, as if the pulse beneath her hand had anchored her in place, holding her where she was needed. The warmth beneath her fingers flickered, weaker for a moment, then steadier again as she leaned in just slightly, her other hand pressing against the stone for balance. Her entire focus narrowed to the connection she could feel strengthening with each passing second. The chamber seemed to respond to it, a low vibration traveling through the floor and walls, subtle but undeniable, as if something long dormant was waking in response to her presence. "You do not understand what you are touching," the voice behind her said, closer still, the calm replaced entirely by tension now. But Lena shook her head slightly, not in denial, but in quiet certainty, because she did understand, not in words, not in logic, but in the way her instincts had guided her here, in the way the rhythm beneath her hand had answered her voice, her presence, her touch. "I understand enough," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. And as the words left her, the pulse surged again, stronger, clearer, undeniable now, filling the space with a presence that could no longer be ignored. The stone beneath her shifted once more, the opening widening just enough to allow a faint trace of light to slip through, not from above, but from below, a dim, silvery glow that flickered against her skin, revealing the outline of something just beneath the surface, something human, or close enough to it, still and silent, but unmistakably alive. Lena's breath caught again, but this time it was not from uncertainty. It was from the sudden, overwhelming clarity that whatever had been hidden here had never been meant to disappear, only to be found by the one who could hear it, feel it, answer it. And in that moment, as the faint light below flickered stronger against her hand, Lena realized that she had not been led here by chance. She had been called, and she had answered. The faint silver glow beneath Lena's hand pulsed again, no longer fragile, no longer fading, but awakening in a way that made the entire chamber feel too small to contain it, as if something long suppressed was beginning to remember what it was meant to be. The outline beneath the opening sharpened just enough for her to make out the shape more clearly now. A form curled slightly, as though confined by the space itself, unmoving yet undeniably present, and the warmth beneath her fingers grew stronger, steadying in response to her touch, like a flame-catching breath. Lena did not look away, even as the air behind her shifted once more, the presence that had followed her no longer attempting to remain subtle, its steps measured but urgent now, each one closing the distance with a quiet intensity that pressed against the edges of the moment. "Step back," the voice repeated, firmer this time, the command no longer hidden beneath calm. But Lena's attention did not break, because the connection beneath her hand had deepened into something that felt impossible to ignore, a pull that settled into her chest and anchored her there. She leaned forward just slightly, enough to let more of her arms slip through the opening, her fingers brushing along the surface beneath until they found something solid, something that felt like skin, warm despite the cold air, and the moment she touched it fully, the glow surged brighter, spreading outward in a soft wave that lit the chamber in flickering silver. Her breath caught as the rhythm beneath her palm aligned completely with her own, the two heartbeats merging into one steady cadence that filled her senses, making everything else fade, the walls, the silence, the voice behind her, all of it distant compared to the presence she could feel awakening beneath her touch. "Stay," she whispered, not to herself, not to the room, but to the one beneath her hand, and the response was immediate, the pulse strengthening, the warmth deepening, as if the simple sound of her voice had given it something to hold on to. The stone around the opening shifted again, a low, hollow sound echoing outward as the barrier loosened further, the edges separating just enough to reveal more of what lay below, the faint outline now clearer, the rise and fall of breath subtle but unmistakable. Behind her, the presence moved closer still, stopping just at the edge of the chamber, no longer hidden, no longer distant, and the air tightened in response, tension threading through the space like a held breath waiting to be released. "You were not meant to find this," the voice said, low and controlled, but the restraint in it had begun to fracture, and Lena felt it without turning, the shift in tone, the shift in intent, but still she did not pull away. Her focus remained fixed on the figure beneath her, on the warmth growing beneath her palm, on the light that continued to flicker and strengthen, as if fed by the connection she refused to break. "Then it should not have called me," she answered quietly, the words leaving her with a certainty she had not questioned, because the truth of them was already written into the rhythm she could feel, into the way the presence beneath her had responded from the very first moment. The chamber seemed to react to her words, the faint vibration deepening into something more pronounced, the stone beneath her knees trembling just slightly as the opening widened another inch, the barrier no longer holding with the same certainty it once had. The glow below brightened again, enough now to cast light across Lena's face, reflecting in her eyes as she leaned closer, her breath shallow, her heart steady, her entire being focused on the one thing that mattered in that moment. Beneath her hand, the form shifted for the first time, not a movement of force, but of awareness, subtle and slow, as if responding to her presence rather than reacting to it, and Lena's breath hitched as the realization settled over her fully, undeniable now, that this was not just something hidden, not just something forgotten, but someone who had been waiting, not for rescue, but for recognition. And as the light beneath her palm grew stronger, casting shadows that danced along the walls, the presence behind her stilled completely, the tension sharpening into something quieter but far more dangerous, because whatever control had been held until now was beginning to slip, and Lena understood, without needing to look back, that the moment she had stepped into this chamber had changed more than just her path. It had set something in motion that could no longer be undone. The shift beneath Lena's hand was no longer subtle. It was unmistakable now, a slow awakening that moved through the figure below like breath returning after a long silence, and the light that had once flickered uncertainly began to steady, growing stronger with each passing second until it filled the narrow space with a soft, silvery glow that refused to be contained. Her fingers did not move, did not withdraw, even as the sensation beneath her palm deepened, the warmth no longer faint but present, alive in a way that made her chest tighten with something she could not name, something that felt both foreign and deeply familiar at the same time. The rhythm between them had become seamless, no longer two separate pulses, but one continuous beat that echoed through her body, grounding her in a way she had never experienced before, as if this connection had been waiting for her long before she understood what it meant. Behind her, the silence broke at last, not with a command, but with a single step that carried a weight far heavier than sound, the presence that had followed her no longer holding back, no longer pretending distance. Lena felt it without turning, the shift in the air, the tightening of something invisible but undeniable, and yet she did not look away from the opening, because the moment unfolding beneath her hands demanded everything she had. "You are interfering with something you cannot control," the voice said, low and steady, but the restraint within it had begun to fracture, the calm giving way to something sharper, more urgent, and Lena's breath slowed as she listened, not to the words, but to the truth beneath them. "Maybe it was never meant to be controlled," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the tension pressing in around her, because the certainty within her had grown stronger than doubt, stronger than fear, anchored in the living presence. Beneath her touch, the figure below shifted again, this time more clearly, a subtle movement that carried intention, awareness threading through stillness, as if the one beneath the stone was beginning to respond not just to her presence, but to her voice, her touch, her existence. The glow intensified, spilling outward in soft waves that traced the edges of the opening, revealing more of the form beneath, the rise and fall of breath clearer now, the faint outline of features emerging from shadow without fully revealing themselves. Lena leaned closer, her free hand bracing against the stone as the chamber around her seemed to tighten, the air humming with a quiet energy that had not been there before, something building, something changing. The presence behind her moved again, closer still, close enough now that she could feel the subtle heat of it at her back, the difference in temperature stark against the cold air of the chamber. And for the first time, Lena understood that whatever stood behind her was no longer simply observing. It was reacting, pulled into the moment in a way it could not ignore. "Pull away," the voice said, quieter now, but far more dangerous, the command no longer spoken for compliance, but for prevention, as if what was happening could still be stopped if she chose to let go. Lena closed her eyes for a brief moment, her fingers pressing more firmly against the warmth beneath her palm, grounding herself in the connection she refused to break, and when she opened them again, there was no hesitation left. "No," she said, not loudly, not defiantly, but with a quiet finality that settled into the space like truth, and the moment the word left her, the pulse surged in response, stronger than ever before. The stone shifted again, the opening widening further with a low, resonant sound that echoed through the chamber, the barrier no longer holding its shape, no longer resisting what had begun. The light beneath her flared brighter, casting sharp shadows across the walls, and the figure below moved once more, this time unmistakably, a slow, deliberate motion that carried awareness, presence, life. Lena's breath caught as the reality of it settled, fully into her chest, undeniable now, that she was not just touching something hidden, she was awakening someone who had been buried beneath layers of silence and stone, waiting not for rescue, but for recognition strong enough to break through. Behind her, the presence stilled completely, the tension sharpening into something deeper, something that no longer sought to interrupt, but to witness, because whatever line had existed before had already been crossed, and there was no returning to what had been before this moment. And as the light beneath Lena's hand continued to grow, steady and unyielding, she realized that the connection she had found was not fragile, not temporary, but inevitable, something that had been waiting long before she ever stepped into the hall above, and now that it had begun, it would not be stopped. The light surged again, no longer contained beneath the broken stone but spilling outward in slow, deliberate waves that brushed against Lena's skin like something alive, something aware, and the moment it touched her fully, the connection deepened in a way that stole the breath from her chest, not from fear, but from the overwhelming clarity of it. The figure beneath her hand moved again, not with uncertainty this time, but with intention, the subtle shift of limbs finding space where there had been none, the slow rise of breath turning into something steadier, stronger, as if the body below was remembering how to exist after being held too long in silence. Lena leaned closer without realizing it, her entire focus narrowing to the presence beneath her, her fingers tracing the faint outline now visible in the glow, the curve of a shoulder, the line of an arm, each detail emerging gradually from shadow into something real. The stone around the opening gave another quiet release, the gap widening just enough to allow more light through, more air, more space, and with it came a subtle change in the atmosphere, a shift that moved through the chamber like a breath being drawn for the first time. Behind her, the presence that had followed her did not step forward again, but it did not retreat either, and the silence it held now was different, no longer attempting control, but watching, measuring, waiting for something that had already begun. Lena could feel it, the weight of that attention, the quiet tension coiled just behind her, but it no longer held the same power over her as it had before, because the connection beneath her hands had become stronger than anything else in the room. "You are not supposed to be here," the voice said again, quieter now, but carrying a depth that had not been there before, something less like a command and more like a truth spoken too late. Lena did not turn, did not pull away, because the presence beneath her hand responded at the same moment, the rhythm surging again, stronger, fuller, and the figure below shifted once more, this time enough for her to feel it directly, the movement brushing against her palm, unmistakable, undeniable. Her breath caught, her heart steadying as the realization settled fully into her chest, that whatever had been hidden here had not been left behind. It had been held, contained, waiting for something to break the silence. "Neither were you," she said softly, the words leaving her without hesitation, because the truth of them felt just as certain as the rhythm beneath her skin. The glow brightened again, no longer flickering but steady, filling the chamber with a soft silver light that traced every edge of the space, revealing details that had once been hidden: the roughness of the walls, the unevenness of the floor, the careful way the stone had been placed to conceal what lay beneath. Lena shifted her weight slightly, her other hand moving to the edge of the opening, fingers gripping the stone as she leaned further forward, her arm reaching deeper now, guided not by sight, but by the connection that had already taken hold. Beneath her touch, the figure responded, the movement more deliberate now, a slow adjustment that brought it closer to the opening, closer to her, and the warmth she felt deepened in response, spreading through her chest in a way that made it impossible to separate where she ended and the other began. The air grew warmer around her, the cold of the chamber receding just slightly as the presence below strengthened, and, for a brief moment, everything else fell away: the silence, the tension, the unseen watcher behind her, all of it distant compared to the living connection she held. Then, without warning, the figure beneath her hand shifted again, more fully this time, rising just enough that the light caught something new, a glimpse of a face emerging from shadow, not fully visible, not yet, but enough to reveal the shape, the presence, the undeniable reality that this was not something forgotten, not something lost, but someone who had been waiting in darkness for a moment that was finally unfolding. Lena's breath stilled as she leaned closer, her gaze fixed on the faint outline, her hand steady against the warmth she refused to release, and in that moment, the silence in the chamber deepened, not from absence, but from anticipation, as if everything around them understood that what came next would not simply change this hidden space, it would reach far beyond it. Behind her, the presence remained still, but the air around it tightened once more, not with control, not with command, but with something far more dangerous, something that recognized what was happening and could no longer pretend it did not matter. And Lena, still kneeling at the edge of the broken stone, understood without needing to turn that whatever stood behind her had felt it too. The shift, the awakening, the undeniable truth that the one beneath her hand was no longer hidden, no longer silent, and no longer alone. The moment the faint outline of a face caught the silver light, everything inside Lena went still, not frozen, but sharpened, as if every part of her awareness had aligned to that single point in time, that single presence emerging from shadow into something real. The features were not fully clear, not yet, but the shape was unmistakable: the curve of a brow, the line of a cheek, the quiet rise of breath that proved without question that the one beneath her hand was alive, and not simply existing, but returning. The connection between them surged again, no longer a rhythm she followed, but one that moved through her entirely, steady and unyielding, grounding her in a way she had never known before. Her fingers remained where they were, resting against warmth that no longer flickered, no longer weakened, but held steady as if it had drawn strength from her presence, from her refusal to let go. She leaned closer, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on the shifting light below, watching as the shadows gave way inch by inch, revealing more of the face beneath, pale against the glow, still but no longer distant, no longer hidden beyond reach. A slow inhale moved through the figure below, deeper than before, stronger, and Lena felt it as if it had happened within her own chest, her breath catching in response as the shared rhythm held firm. Behind her, the silence changed again, not broken, but tightened, the presence that had once tried to command now holding itself still with a restraint that felt deliberate, controlled, and yet no longer absolute. Lena did not need to turn to know that something had shifted there as well, something that mirrored the awakening before her, something that recognized it. The air in the chamber felt different now, no longer cold and still, but alive with a quiet energy that pressed outward, filling the space between them, touching the walls, the floor, the unseen edges of something larger than the room itself. "You should not continue," the voice said, low, measured, but no longer certain, the command replaced by something that felt almost like caution, and Lena's eyes flickered for just a second, not away from the figure beneath her, but inward, toward the certainty that had already taken root. "It is already happening," she answered softly, her voice calm, steady, because there was no longer a question of stopping, no longer a choice that could undo what had begun. Beneath her hand, The figure shifted again, this time more clearly, a slow movement that brought it closer to the opening, closer to her touch, and the lights surged in response, illuminating more of the face, enough now for her to see the faint parting of lips, the subtle change in expression that marked the transition from stillness to awareness. Her breath caught again, but this time it carried something else, something deeper than surprise, something that felt like recognition without memory, as if she had always known this presence without ever having seen it before. The stone at the edge of the opening gave another quiet release, the gap widening just enough for the figure beneath to shift upward, drawn by the same force that held Lena in place, the same connection that refused to break. Her hand adjusted instinctively, not pulling away, but guiding, supporting without force, allowing the movement to happen without resistance. The air around them warmed further, the cold retreating in slow, deliberate waves, replaced by something softer, something that felt almost like the beginning of light after a long night. Lena's heart remained steady, anchored in the shared rhythm that had not faltered once since it began, and as she leaned closer, the glow reflecting fully in her eyes now, she understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that this moment was not an accident, not a mistake, but something that had been waiting for the exact point in time when she would be there to answer it. Behind her, the presence shifted again, closer now, no longer holding distance, and for the first time, Lena felt it clearly, not just as pressure in the air, but as something alive, something aware, something that had been drawn into this moment just as surely as she had. But still, she did not turn, did not look away, because the one beneath her hand moved again, rising just enough that the light caught fully across the face now, revealing eyes that had not yet opened, but would, and when they did, nothing would remain the same. The silence in the chamber deepened, not from absence, but from expectation, from the quiet understanding that something long hidden had reached the edge of revelation, and Lena, still kneeling at the threshold between darkness and light, felt it in every breath, every heartbeat, every unbroken moment that led to what came next. The first movement of his eyes was not sudden, not sharp, but slow, deliberate, like something ancient remembering how to return to the surface, and when the faint line of his lashes lifted just enough for the silver light to catch beneath them, Lena felt the shift. Before she saw it, a change in the rhythm between them that deepened into something far more powerful than before. Her breath stilled completely as his eyes opened, not fully at once, but gradually, revealing a color that seemed to hold the same light that filled the chamber, pale and piercing, reflective like polished metal beneath moonlight, and the moment they focused, the connection between them surged into something undeniable. It was no longer a shared rhythm. It was a pull, a force that anchored her in place and reached through her at the same time, as if every part of her had been waiting for that exact moment without ever knowing why. His gaze did not move past her, did not search the space around them. It locked onto her with a clarity that erased everything else, the chamber, the shadows, the presence behind her, all of it fading into something distant compared to the intensity of that single connection. Lena did not pull away, even as the weight of that gaze settled over her, not heavy, not overwhelming, but absolute, like something that had already decided and did not need to ask. Beneath her hand, the warmth grew stronger still, the rise of his breath steady and sure now, the stillness of his body giving way to awareness that moved through him slowly but unmistakably. Her fingers tightened just slightly, not in fear, but in response, grounding herself in the contact that had brought this moment into existence. "You are awake," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. But the moment they did, his gaze sharpened, the focus deepening in a way that made her chest tighten, not from fear, but from recognition she could not explain. The light around them pulsed once, brighter than before, casting sharp reflections across his features now that they were no longer hidden, revealing the strong lines of his face, the quiet tension held beneath stillness, the presence of something far more powerful than the fragile state he had been in moments before. Behind her, the silence broke in a way that felt entirely different from before, not controlled, not measured, but restrained with effort that had begun to strain. "Step away from him," the voice said. Lower now, more dangerous, the calm stripped away entirely, and Lena felt it press against her back, a force that carried authority, expectation, command. But she did not move, because the man beneath her had shifted again, rising just slightly, enough for his shoulder to come closer to the opening, enough for the light to follow him upward, and the connection between them tightened in response, stronger than anything else in the room. His gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering, as if she were the only point of reference in a world he had just returned to, and Lena understood, without needing words, that whatever he was, whatever he had been, he recognized her in a way that did not require explanation. "Do not touch him," the voice behind her said again, closer now, the restraint thinning further, but Lena's hand did not move, because pulling away felt impossible, not physically, but instinctively, as if breaking the connection now would undo something that had just been restored. The man beneath her drew another breath, deeper this time, and with it came a subtle shift in the air, a change that moved outward from him, filling the chamber with a presence that was no longer hidden, no longer contained. Lena felt it against her skin, in her chest, in the steady beat of her heart that still matched his, and for the first time, she realized that the connection was not one-sided. It was not just her reaching him, it was him reaching back. His eyes flickered briefly, not away from her, but deeper, as if recognizing something beyond sight, and then his lips parted slightly, the smallest movement, but enough to send a quiet tremor through the space between them. No sound came at first, only breath, only presence, but the intent was there, forming, rising, and Lena leaned closer without realizing it, drawn in by something she could not resist. Behind her, the presence shifted again, closer than ever, the tension in the room tightening to the point of breaking. But still she did not turn, did not move, because the man beneath her had found her fully now. And when his voice finally came, low and rough from disuse yet unmistakably clear, it carried only one word, spoken not as a question, not as uncertainty, but as something claimed and known. "Mine." The word did not echo loudly through the chamber, yet it filled every inch of space with a weight that could not be ignored, settling into the stone, into the air, into Lena's chest like something that had always belonged there, waiting only for the moment it would be spoken. She did not move, did not pull away, because the connection between them tightened instantly, the shared rhythm surging into something deeper, stronger, no longer just a bond of awareness, but a claim that resonated through her very breath. His eyes did not leave hers, not even for a second, and there was no confusion in them, no hesitation, only certainty, quiet and absolute, as if the darkness he had risen from had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving behind only truth. Beneath her hand, his body shifted again, not weak, not uncertain, but deliberate, the slow movement of strength returning in measured waves, guided not by force, but by presence, by awareness, by something far older than the silence he had been buried in. Lena felt it in the way the air changed around him, the subtle warmth that spread outward, pushing back the cold that had once filled the chamber, replacing it with something steady, something alive. Her breath came slower now, calmer, as if her body had adjusted to the connection, accepted it without question, even if her mind had not yet caught up. Behind her, the presence that had once held control of the situation broke its silence completely, the tension no longer restrained, the shift unmistakable as a step carried forward with intent that no longer hid behind caution. "You do not understand what you have done," the voice said, sharper now, no longer measured, and Lena felt it press against her back like a force trying to reclaim something already lost. But she did not turn, because the man beneath her had moved again, rising further, the edge of the opening no longer enough to contain him, the stone giving way in quiet fractures that widened the space without resistance, as if the structure itself had abandoned its purpose. His gaze remained locked on hers, unwavering, and as he drew another steady breath, Lena felt the shift ripple through her, a pull that anchored her more firmly than anything else in the room. "I did not do this," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension building around them, because the truth of it was undeniable. This moment had not been created by her, only answered. His expression changed then, subtly, the faintest shift in the line of his mouth, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something that carried recognition deeper than either, and for a brief second, the intensity in his gaze softened just enough to reveal something beneath it, something that felt less like possession and more like certainty fulfilled. The chamber seemed to react to him fully now, the faint vibrations strengthening into a quiet hum that traveled through the stone, through the air, through Lena herself, as if the entire space acknowledged his return. The light that surrounded him no longer flickered. It held steady, illuminating his features clearly now, no longer hidden by shadow. And Lena realized with a sudden, quiet clarity that this was not just someone who had been buried. This was someone who had been contained. Behind her, the presence moved again, closer still, no longer hesitant, no longer observing. And this time Lena felt it fully, the weight of it pressing into the space between them, a presence that carried authority, expectation, and something else beneath it, something far more dangerous. Step away from him. The voice demanded, no longer asking, no longer warning. But Lena's hand did not move, because the connection between her and the man before her had already surpassed anything that command could reach. His eyes flickered then, not away from her, but past her for the briefest moment, acknowledging the presence behind her without turning his head, and something in the air shifted instantly, tension sharpening into something electric, something that felt like the edge of a storm waiting to break. Lena felt it, the change in him, the subtle tightening of something beneath the calm surface, the awareness of another presence intruding on the moment that had been entirely theirs, and for the first time. Since his eyes had opened, his attention split, not fully, but enough to acknowledge what stood behind her. His hand moved then, slowly, deliberately, rising just enough to reach the edge of the opening, his fingers brushing against the stone before finding her wrist, not gripping, not pulling, but resting there with a quiet certainty that sent another wave of warmth through her chest. The contact was steady, grounding, and the moment it settled, Lena understood something without needing words, that the claim he had spoken was not meant to bind her, but to anchor something that had already been formed. Behind her, the presence stilled, the tension coiling tighter as if preparing for something that had not yet happened but could no longer be avoided. And Lena, still kneeling at the edge of the broken stone, felt the moment stretch into something inevitable, something that would not remain hidden much longer, because what had been buried was no longer willing to stay beneath the surface, and what had awakened was no longer alone. The contact at her wrist did not tighten, did not demand, yet it anchored Lena more firmly than any command ever could, a quiet certainty settling through her bones, as if the connection between them had roots deeper than the moment itself. His fingers were warm against her skin, steady and intentional, and the moment that touch formed, the shared rhythm between them deepened again, no longer just aligned, but intertwined in a way that made it impossible to separate where one ended and the other began. Lena's breath slowed, her chest rising and falling in time with his, the chamber around them fading further into the background as the presence between them grew stronger, clearer, undeniable. He shifted again, rising higher now, the edge of the broken stone no longer enough to conceal him, his shoulders emerging fully into the light, the silver glow tracing the lines of his form as if revealing something that had been hidden not just from sight, but from the world itself. The air responded to him, warming in slow, deliberate waves, the cold that had once defined the chamber retreating completely, replaced by something that felt almost like the first light of morning after a long and silent night. Lena did not pull her hand away, even as his presence grew, even as the space between them closed further, because the connection that held them was no longer fragile, no longer uncertain. It was steady, grounded, something that had already chosen its place. Behind her, the presence that had once controlled every movement in this space stepped forward fully at last, no longer holding distance, no longer waiting. The shift in the air was immediate, sharp, the quiet tension snapping into something more defined, more dangerous, as if two forces had finally acknowledged each other without the barrier of silence. "You will release him," the voice said, low and controlled, but the restraint within it had tightened to the point of breaking, and Lena felt it press against her back like a force trying to separate what had already been joined. She did not move, not because she refused, but because the idea of releasing him no longer existed as a possibility within her. Beneath her hand, he shifted again, fully aware now, fully present, his gaze lifting just slightly from hers to acknowledge the presence behind her, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with something far more controlled, something that held quiet authority without needing to be spoken. The air between them changed instantly, tension sharpening into something almost tangible, the space no longer just a chamber beneath the hall, but something else entirely, something that felt like the center of a moment that would not remain hidden. Lena felt it, the way the balance shifted, the way the silence now held meaning instead of absence, and still, her hand remained where it was, resting against him, steady, unwavering. "She stays," he said, his voice no longer rough with disuse, but steady, grounded, carrying a weight that settled into the stone itself. And the moment the words left him, the chamber seemed to respond, the faint hum deepening into something more pronounced, as if the space itself recognized his presence fully now. Behind Lena, the presence stilled, not retreating, but pausing, the tension coiling tighter as if recalculating, as if the certainty it had once held had been disrupted in a way it had not anticipated. Lena felt the shift immediately, the subtle change in pressure, the hesitation that replaced command, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, she understood that whatever had brought her here had not accounted for this outcome. His hand at her wrist moved slightly, not pulling, not guiding, but settling more firmly, the contact grounding both of them as he rose further from the space below, the last of the stone giving way quietly beneath him without resistance. The silver light that surrounded him no longer flickered. It held steady, illuminating the chamber completely now, leaving no space untouched, no shadow deep enough to conceal what had been hidden. Lena's breath caught as she finally saw him fully, no longer a shape beneath the surface, no longer a presence in the dark, but a man who stood between what had been buried and what was now revealed, his gaze returning to hers with the same unbroken certainty that had never once faltered. Behind her, the presence shifted again, not stepping forward, not retreating, but adjusting in a way that carried a new weight, something less like control and more like recognition, as if it now understood what had been set into motion. The chamber held that moment in stillness, the air thick with everything unspoken, everything that had changed in the span of breaths, and Lena, still kneeling at the edge of what had once been sealed, realized that nothing about this space would remain hidden any longer, because what had been awakened was no longer something that could be contained, and what had been claimed would not be undone. For a single breath, nothing moved, not the air, not the stone, not even the faint hum that had filled the chamber moments before, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge what now stood fully revealed between them. Lena remained where she was, her hand still resting against him, her wrist still held in that steady, unyielding contact, and yet everything about the moment had shifted, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but settled into something that felt inevitable. He stood before her now, no longer hidden, no longer contained, the silver light that had once flickered beneath the stone now surrounding him completely, casting a quiet glow that reached every corner of the chamber, leaving no shadow deep enough to conceal what had been brought into the open. His gaze did not waver from hers, not even as the presence behind her adjusted again, not even as the tension in the room sharpened into something that could no longer be ignored. Lena felt it clearly now, the awareness of two forces in the same space, one that had controlled, one that had been contained, and the moment between them that had changed everything. The hand at her wrist shifted slightly, not to pull, not to restrain, but to guide, a subtle movement that encouraged her to rise. And for the first time since she had knelt at the edge of the broken stone, Lena moved with intention rather than instinct, her body responding to him as naturally as breath. She stood slowly, her balance steady, her gaze never leaving his, and as she did, the connection between them remained unbroken, the shared rhythm continuing without interruption, as if standing did not separate them, but aligned them more fully. The air around them warmed further, the cold that had once defined the chamber completely gone now, replaced by something that felt almost like presence made tangible, something that carried weight without pressure, something that filled the space without crowding it. Behind her, The presence that had once commanded the room stepped forward at last, no longer holding back, no longer observing from a distance. And the shift was immediate, the quiet tension breaking into something defined, something that demanded acknowledgement. Lena felt it at her back, the authority, the expectation, the unspoken demand for control to be restored. But when she turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge without breaking the connection before her, what she felt was not certainty, but calculation, a pause where there had once been command. "This ends now," the voice said, steady but edged with something new, something that no longer carried absolute control, and Lena understood without needing to question. That whatever had been planned had already been disrupted beyond repair. She turned back to him fully then, her focus returning to the one who had risen from beneath the stone, and as she did, his hand released her wrist only to shift upward, not to take, not to claim again, but to rest briefly against her hand, palm to palm, a contact that felt equal, grounded, chosen. His gaze softened just slightly, not losing its intensity, but changing in a way that spoke of something deeper than the moment itself, something that extended beyond the chamber, beyond the hall above, beyond everything that had led to this point. "It does not end," he said quietly, his voice steady, carrying a calm that did not need to rise to be heard. And the moment the words settled into the air, the space around them responded, the faint hum returning, not as tension, but as acknowledgement. Lena felt it through her fingertips, through her chest, through the steady rhythm that had not faltered since the moment their connection had formed, and for the first time, she understood what it meant, not just as a moment, not just as an event, but as something that would continue beyond this place. Behind her, the presence stilled completely, the shift in control undeniable now, the silence no longer empty, but filled with the understanding that what had been hidden had been found, and what had been contained had been released. The chamber held that truth in stillness, the broken stone at their feet no longer a barrier, but a mark of what had been changed, and Lena, standing beside him now rather than above him, realized that the line between what had been beneath and what had been above no longer existed. As the silver light settled into something steady and enduring, his gaze lifted slightly, not away from her, but beyond, toward the unseen world above them. And when he spoke again, the words were not directed only at her, but at everything that had once believed this moment would never come. "They will hear us now,"